So we're going to take kind of a high-level overview of ICOs or ICOs, which are initial coin offerings, crypto splits, smart contracts, and blockchain technology. Excuse me, technology in general. And all of this is going to kind of be in the context of Bitcoins because that's the most well-known cryptocurrency out there. But a lot of this stuff would apply to really any cryptocurrency that you would read about or hear about. So let's start right off with defining what a cryptocurrency is. And so cryptocurrency is a decentralized digital cash system. And like I said, Bitcoin's the most well-known. And depending on who you ask, it's either famous or infamous. Some people still associate Bitcoin with, the Silk Road bus and buying drugs and things online. It's been legitimized quite a bit since then. It's actually, they're going to start futures trading later this month, and the NASDAQ is going to, I think the regulatory approval was just done yesterday or the day before, but it'll be listed on NASDAQ starting next year sometime. So like I said, there are other cryptocurrencies out there. I've listed a few others up there. Those are the other, arguably the other three better known cryptocurrencies. And I should note that there's actually been attempts at digital cash systems prior to Bitcoin. Bitcoin came out in 2009, roughly. But way back in the 90s, there was actually a product called DigiCash that used more of a centralized validation authority. And it was just too slow. It was maybe ahead of its time, depending on who you ask. But it just never picked up steam, and it died pretty quick. So the problem with any sort of digital product or digital asset, or in this case, digital cash, is how do you keep people from just copying the crap out of it? Because the recording industry and the movie industry, they'll tell you to no end, it's impossible to stop people from finding a way to copy something that you want protected or limited distribution and then just freely giving it away. And so Bitcoin, one of Bitcoin's greatest inventions, or arguably the greatest invention of Bitcoin, is the blockchain technology. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail a little bit later. But just for right now, blockchain technology is a decentralized validation system. So it uses multiple computers spread out throughout the world, arguably, to verify transactions based on encrypted algorithms. And so before we talk about how a Bitcoin transaction actually takes place, which that's what my props are for here, I wanted to talk just briefly about how cryptocurrencies split. So we know that cryptocurrencies use blockchains to validate transactions, and that's how you know that you can transact with this digital cash system with Bitcoins. But these blockchains, they're essentially software. And so they have a source code, and when there's a disagreement between how the source code should be modified, that creates what's called hard forks in the blockchain. And when you have a hard fork, that means that you get a new blockchain that no longer operates the way that the old one used to operate. And so if 100% of the blockchain network doesn't adopt the new way of doing it, then you now have two cryptocurrencies. So you have the original, which has their network operating under whatever the original rules were, and then you have a subset of those people that break off that want to follow the new rules that they've agreed are better, and they create this new cryptocurrency. Bitcoin's seen a few of them already. I've listed a couple of them there, Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Gold. They're both forks of the original Bitcoin Classic. And there was actually a split, and this was supposed to be a pretty major split. It changed quite a bit of the underlying technology of the blockchain. It was supposed to happen last month. It was called the SegWit 2X fork. And it was called off at the very last minute, like literally the day before it was supposed to go into effect. And there's speculation as to why that happened. Some people say that they didn't get enough people to buy in to the new network to make it functional. Other people just say that they're just holding off and they're going to do it at a later date. So it's possible we could see that split come about later. And so like I said, the splits usually occur when there's a disagreement over how the blockchain should be administered and what the rules and what the technical specifications of the blockchain should be going forward. One of the main things that Bitcoin has seen is as it's grown in popularity and as it's seen the volume of transactions increase, the time to validate these transactions on the blockchain, which is one of the key benefits of these virtual currencies, is that they're instant or near instant processing. That validation time has increased because the blockchain is not able to handle that many transactions. And so one of the forks, the SegWit2x fork, was supposed to increase the size of the blockchain blocks to help allow a greater volume of transactions occur. So we know what a cryptocurrency is now. We know how they split apart and basically how the blockchain works to help validate those transactions. But how do you use a Bitcoin, right? That's one of the other main questions I get. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as I could think of, which maybe I made it too simple, so we'll see. But so for example, if you have an apple in the real world, you know, and I give the apple to somebody. So for example, if I give it to Dennis here, so I no longer have that apple now. Now, assuming I didn't buy a bushel of apples, I no longer have any apples to give to anybody else, okay? And the apple that I gave to Dennis, I have no way of controlling that now. I can't cut it up. I can't, you know, put it in the refrigerator, do whatever. And Dennis can do whatever he wants to do with it now. So, yeah, that's not exactly the same with the digital apple, though. So, for example, I've printed out a picture of an apple that, you know, you just download from the internet, right? And it is free use rights, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. So, you know, I could send that picture on my computer. I could send that to all of you via email and would look identical to the original that I'm still storing on my computer. Now, that doesn't work entirely the same if it's in the real world, because everybody knows if you take an original picture and then you make a copy of it, it doesn't quite look the same, right? Like this one's black and white, right? So by the time you've made a few dozen copies, you end up with something like this that looks not very similar to the original, right? And so what happens here is the same thing happens digitally. It's just more subtle. And so, yeah, and that's actually all I need, thanks. And so the same thing happens digitally. It's just, it's not recognizable to us. When we're looking at the file, it looks identical to us. But there's a difference in the hash code of each of those files. Every time I make a copy, there's a little bit of data that changes. And whether that's because of the associated metadata with the file or just for transactional purposes, there's a shift in the hash code. This shift in the hash code is what the blockchain relies on. So it can verify the original hash code that was issued to a Bitcoin, and if somebody tries to copy that and pass it off as the same one, that hash code will change just slightly. But it's enough that the blockchain will know, okay, that's not the same hash code that I sent out and approved, so that's not real. That's not a real Bitcoin. We're not going to approve that transaction. So that's basically how you use a Bitcoin. You receive a Bitcoin from an exchange, or well, you purchase a Bitcoin from an exchange. So currently the price is back over $10,000. So if you want a full Bitcoin, you give your $10,000 to an exchange, and the largest one in the US is Coinbase, and then they in return give you a Bitcoin that you store in your digital wallet. And then after that, you can use it just like any other cash system, anywhere it's accepted. You know, Overstock.com is one of the first people that started accepting Bitcoins to purchase, you know, furniture and other goods. So you add a couch to your cart, you check out, and then you enter in the hash code that we were just talking about, the one that's assigned to you. You enter in that hash code at checkout, and then you've now bought that item, and the Bitcoin is transferred to the party that is receiving the payment in return for the goods. And so one thing I'll also mention, just as an anecdote, if you have a fraction of a Bitcoin, it's called a Satoshi, and it's after the inventor of Bitcoin. And so let's move into regulation. So there is definitely a conscious movement to try to regulate Bitcoins, and it's becoming more of an effort more recently. There's still no federal level regulation yet, and I stress the yet because there's already an act that's been introduced it was co-sponsored by our own Senator Grassley, and it's called the Combating Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing, and Counterfeiting Act of 2017. So it doesn't necessarily sound like it has anything to do with Bitcoin right off the bat, but it's directed. The goal of this act is to help the federal government seize digital assets like Bitcoins to help law enforcement agencies stop the illegal activities that make up the namesake of the act. But there are critics that say that it's too broad the way it's written. And they basically say that Bitcoins, because of their digital nature, can be carried very easily. You can carry it on a piece of paper with just the hash code written down in your wallet. You can carry it on your mobile phone. It's on your laptop if you store your account on your laptop. And so the requirement of this act is that you would have to declare that Bitcoin prior to traveling out of or back into the US. Otherwise, it would be subject to seizure by Customs and Border Patrol. And this, one thing I'll note is this only applies if you have over $10,000 in Bitcoin. But given that one Bitcoin is over $10,000, if you have one Bitcoin, you're now subject to this regulation. And so critics are saying that it just creates too much of a burden on travelers that, you know, every time they go with their laptop to Cancun, they have to declare that they have one Bitcoin on their laptop. Otherwise, they're going to lose that Bitcoin when they try to come back or leave the country. So it'll be interesting to see if this is amended or if it passes as is or what happens to it in the future. Now, the IRS is the other big entity that's provided guidance as far as Bitcoin taxation in this case in the U.S. And so the IRS has stated back in 2014 that even though Bitcoins can be used to purchase goods and services, it's not considered a currency by the IRS. Instead, it's considered a property asset. And so they basically say that it's taxed just like any other property, but it's depending on how the taxpayer categorizes that property. So it would be subject to capital gains and losses taxes if the taxpayer treats it as a capital asset. So if they're holding it in an account on the hope that it raises value, then that would be subject to capital gains or losses taxes. Now, if you're an employee or an employer paying employees in Bitcoins, then it would be taxed as federally withheld payroll taxes, and you'd file a W-2 just like any other paycheck. And then if you're an independent contractor, you have to disclose any payments that you receive in cryptocurrencies, and then you would be subject to self-employment taxes on those as well. So it's kind of a shifting idea as to how it's taxed, but the underlying takeaway is that it is taxed. And actually, just earlier this week, Coinbase, which again is the largest exchange in the U.S., they were just required to turn over records on over 14,000 account holders to the IRS. That basically the IRS wants these records so they can verify that all these people have paid taxes appropriately between the years of 2013 and 2015. And so more than likely that's not the case. So somebody's going to be getting a very unfriendly letter from the IRS soon. Now, FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they've also issued guidance back in 2013. But this guidance was not directed towards individuals, like a taxpayer for the IRS. It was directed towards virtual currency administrators and exchange operators. So this would be more for the people that run the Bitcoin blockchain technology or the Bitcoin technology in general. And it would also be for people like Coinbase or entities like Coinbase that are operating these exchanges that allow people to trade in US dollars or whatever fiat currency they're using to purchase these cryptocurrencies. And basically, FinCEN's guidance says that these people, these administrators and exchange companies, they are money transmitters, which makes them subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, as well as the money services business regulations that FinCEN has put out for traditional banking money transmitters. They did expressly say that end users and payment processors are excluded from the FinCEN guidance. And the payment processors is important because that Overstock.com or PayPal or whoever that's taking the Bitcoin that you're offering in exchange for these goods and services, they don't have to comply with these money transmitter laws, which helps the adoption of Bitcoin for end goods and services that will increase the adoption of the cryptocurrency. Now, from a state regulation standpoint, there's not a lot of state regulations out there yet. More than likely, we'll see more coming. The Uniform Law Commission, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, they did approve a model regulation, so we'll probably see some states start looking at that pretty seriously. But as of right now, roughly 13 states have some sort of regulations or guidance or some sort of position as far as cryptocurrencies or blockchain technology goes. Iowa is not one of them. They have no enacted regulations or guidance, and they have none pending that I'm aware of anyway. So as you might guess, different states have taken different positions as to how they're regulating Bitcoin, and they kind of run the spectrum. Some of them are very friendly, like Texas, which is arguably the most Bitcoin-friendly state in that it doesn't require any sort of license for somebody to sell Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in Texas. So if you're operating an exchange in Texas, you're taking US dollars in exchange for giving somebody a Bitcoin, you don't need a license. Kansas is similar to Texas. They actually modeled their guidance off of Texas. And then some of the other friendly ones are Tennessee and South Carolina and Montana. Illinois is one that is kind of interesting, actually, because they don't have any official regulations yet, but they have provided guidance saying that they're only going to require exchanges and virtual currency ATMs to comply with Illinois' Transmitters of Money Act. And basically, Bitcoin ATMs are where you can input US dollars and get a hash code for Bitcoin out. So it's kind of the opposite of a traditional ATM. And the other thing with Illinois is they actually just recently passed House Resolution 120, which creates an intergovernmental task force to find different applications of the blockchain technology in the public sector. So they're trying to find ways to adopt blockchain technology to increase efficiencies within the public sector. And we'll actually talk about this a little bit later with smart contracts, but they actually have a private trial going on in Cook County to use blockchain technology with real estate records. So New York is probably the most famous as far as cryptocurrency regulations go. And that's because of basically how hostile they are towards cryptocurrencies. What they've basically enacted is bit license regulation, is what it's known as. And it requires licenses for any resident or entity within the state that's undertaking business activities using virtual currencies. So anyone that's receiving virtual currencies for transmission, storing, holding, or maintaining custody for other people, or they're buying and selling virtual currencies as a customer business, or they're providing exchange services, or administering or issuing virtual currency, they're all subject to this bit license requirement. The two exceptions to the bit license requirement are those that are purely developing virtual currency software, so they're not actually handling virtual currency, they're just creating the software that is maybe the front end for another exchange or something like that, as well as consumers that are just using virtual currency for the purpose of sale and purchase of goods and services. These are the only two exceptions to the bit license requirement. Everybody else pretty much has to get a bit license. Now, what's made it difficult is that the bit license scheme was set up in New York in August 8th of 2015 is when it went into effect. Since then, up until January of 2017, there's only been 3 bit licenses that have been issued and approved. Everyone else has been denied. So, you know, arguably, the industry is correct in saying that New York's pretty hostile towards Bitcoins. So in September, Circle was awarded, September of 2015, Circle was awarded the very first bit license, and then there was one in 2016, Ripple, and then Coinbase just earlier this year, at the beginning of this year in January. So the last state that I want to touch on is California. California is another one that hasn't enacted any regulations or guidance yet, but in the 2015 legislature session in California, they did try to, they did introduce the digital currency bill, which I've got the citation there in the middle. It didn't pass, but they've introduced a new one again this year in this session. It's the virtual currency regulation bill, and it almost exactly mirrors New York's bit license regulations. So most people are assuming that California will be Bitcoin unfriendly in the future, whether that's this year or somewhere down the road, we're not sure. Like I mentioned before, the Uniform Law Commission, it has been working on its own model regulations, which were just approved at this year's national conference back in July. And so more than likely we'll start seeing states adopt this model regulation with or without changes in the near future. And I've got the URL to access the model regulation at the end of the slide there. But you know, to synopsize the model regulation, it basically identifies the activities in cryptocurrency that require protection, and they identified the storage, transfer, and exchange of virtual currency on behalf of others as the primary activity that needs to be protected. And so another unique thing about the model regulation is that it doesn't apply where there's other regulation that's deemed adequate. So for example, the model regulation doesn't speak to the actual transfer of funds for buying Bitcoin or that sort of activity, because they say that, you know, something like the Electronic Funds Transfer Act is adequate to cover that kind of activity. They also identified exemptions, and it's similar to New York's bit license exemptions, but it basically says that banks and companies that merely provide software, computing power, or other services that enable virtual currency business are exempt from the model regulation. And then they also say that individuals are also exempt, as well as academic use and de minimis use. They won't fall under this Uniform Law Commission's model regulation. So the focus of the model regulation is to require covered entities to maintain the 3 things that are listed on this slide. One is that they maintain enough virtual currency to satisfy the entitlements of its users, so they have to have enough virtual currency to cover the amount of virtual currency that their account holders or customers have. And this is, I'm speculating a bit here, but I'm guessing this is in response to all the numerous hacks that you might have read about that occur with some of these exchanges. Mt. Gox was one of the more famous ones where they were subject to a hack, and they tried to cover up the hack by basically running almost like a pyramid scheme. So they were taking money in from new investors, and they were using that Bitcoin to cover withdrawals from other investors because they had been hacked somewhere at some point and had lost quite a bit of Bitcoin, but didn't want to fess up to it. So I'm guessing that had a strong influence on the model commission taking that first position. And then the second one that they focused on is ensuring that the property interests of the customers are pro rata in the event of a shortfall. And so basically they want to make sure that the heaviest investors get the largest share first. And then the last one is that the virtual currency of customers is not the property of the virtual currency business, and that it's not reachable by the creditors of the virtual currency business. So if an exchange goes belly up, they want to make sure that its customers' currency is safe and that it's not subject to a creditor of the exchange. The model regulation does also require the business to register within the designated state that adopts this model regulation, and they have to provide evidence of adequate capital on a regular basis. Now, the one thing that they did provide that industry stakeholders liked is that they provide an on-ramp process to this regulatory scheme, and so basically they provided a stepwise model that successively increases the amount of regulations that startups have to comply with. And that's what it's basically meant to do. Is it's supposed to ease the burden of a cryptocurrency startup so that they can start small, they can comply with a few of the regulations, and as they grow, they can go to full compliance. And so some of the other cryptocurrencies, I mentioned these on the first slide: Ethereum, Litecoin, and Ripple. They're arguably some of the better known alternative cryptocurrencies, but there are literally thousands more out there. And there are more coming pretty much on a monthly or maybe even more frequent basis. And that's done through initial coin offerings, or ICOs. So as far as ICOs go in the US, the SEC's position is that most of these ICOs are considered securities transactions, and so they have to comply with the existing securities regulations that the SEC has in place. Now, there is a test to determine whether an ICO is covered by securities regulation or not. And basically, if they can pass the Howey test, which is a test back from the Supreme Court case in 1946, if they can pass the Howey test, they don't need to comply with the existing securities regulations. And when I say pass, that means that they don't meet all of the required elements that are listed there, the 3 elements. If they meet all 3 of the elements listed in the Howey test, then they've failed the test, which means they are subject to the securities regulations. And arguably, the two that are going to become more important are, is it an actual investment of money versus is it just, are you buying a product? So if I'm buying a Bitcoin, that's arguably a digital product that I'm buying, or a digital asset. If I'm investing money on a cryptocurrency that doesn't exist yet, on the idea that I'm getting in on the ground floor so I get the best return, then that's going to be an investment of money rather than buying a good or a service. And the other one is the first part of the third element, which is was there an expectation of profits? And so am I buying this cryptocurrency hoping that it'll increase 12,000%? Or am I just buying this cryptocurrency so I can buy other goods and services down the road? And like I said, most ICOs, they do fall within the security or secured transaction definition. Around the world, we've seen a couple countries just outright ban ICOs. China and South Korea, they've both taken the position that they're not going to allow ICOs at all. And the ban by China was an especially hard blow because they're arguably as large as the US as far as cryptocurrency market. The EU has provided guidance stating that there's a very high risk with ICOs, but they basically haven't banned them. But they've also said that if you have a dispute with an ICO because they take your money and run, you have no recourse through the EU judicial system. So you're on your own. Canada and Russia, they've taken kind of a unique stance. They've created regulatory sandboxes. So they basically allow ICOs to experiment for a certain amount of time without being compliant with any of the securities regulations that they have. But after that time period, that sandbox time period, they have to start complying with these regulations. And that's what a lot of industry stakeholders wanted the SEC to do as well. They wanted the SEC to create a US regulatory sandbox, but obviously that's not the way the SEC went. And pretty much every government has cautioned against investment in ICOs as very risky. The US, UK, and Germany have taken especially strong positions as far as warning against ICO investments. But that hasn't stopped people from doing the investments, and there have even been some celebrities, and I'll use the term celebrities loosely because I don't think we're talking about any A-list celebrities here. But there was actually a celebrity that put out a warning, and it was Jordan Belfort, who is better known as the Wolf of Wall Street. And he called ICOs the biggest scam ever in his interview with Fortune magazine in October, which is kind of ironic given that he is one of the biggest fraudsters Wall Street's ever seen. So, you know, people kind of took that as, oh my God, even this fraudster thinks ICOs are terrible. But there have been other celebrities that have been endorsed ICOs on the hope that the additional attention that they would garner would drive up the price of the ICO. So Floyd Mayweather, he endorsed Stocks Coin, and Paris Hilton, she endorsed Lydian Coin. Paris Hilton has since backed away from her endorsement because of some sort of reputation issue with the operators of Lydian Coin. So I'm not sure if her endorsement still stands. But the SEC has also stated that the celebrity endorsements of ICOs could be potentially unlawful as well. So, you know, these celebrities, we might see some prosecution against them if it turns out that the SEC decides that it is actually unlawful. So let's talk about blockchain technology. And it looks like I'm running a little low on time, so I'll try to go through this quickly. But like I said before, blockchain technology is a decentralized peer-to-peer validation technology, and it came about with Bitcoin, but it's taken kind of a life of its own. So traditionally, the way you validate a transaction is you give your money to the bank sends that check or that instrument to a central authority or a clearinghouse, and they okay it or validate it, and then the funds are released in connection with that instrument. Blockchain technology instead, it uses a decentralized network of computers that can be located anywhere in the world. And each of these computers, they have a copy of the blockchain ledger, which can be either publicly accessible or it can be privately owned, either way. But in the instance of Bitcoin, it's a publicly available ledger. Anybody can look at the ledger of the entire blockchain all the way back to 2009. And every computer in Bitcoin's blockchain network has a copy of that ledger. And so in order for somebody to compromise or make a fraudulent transaction using Bitcoin, they would have to compromise arguably a majority of this entire blockchain network. So they would have to compromise thousands of computers in order to transact one fraudulent transaction. So that's one of the security advantages of the blockchain technology. Now, like I mentioned, there's a digital ledger that goes with this blockchain. So once a transaction is verified as valid, it's added as a new block to the blockchain, and it becomes part of that publicly available ledger. And again, that ledger is distributed across the entire network, and everything within this network is encrypted. And so the computers across the world, they all talk using a secured communication protocol. And so that's why they can all manipulate the same data, the copies that they have, securely. So when data comes in that's representing a transaction, so let's go back to that Overstock.com purchase. If I use a Bitcoin to buy something on a website, then that transaction is transmitted to the entire blockchain network. The blockchain network will evaluate it using predefined rules and algorithms, and that's where it checks that hash code to make sure it's valid. And once it's approved or once it's validated, then it's added to the blockchain ledger as a new block, and anybody can view that ledger. And so again, if somebody wants to fake that ledger or add something in or take something out of that ledger, they again would have to compromise the entire network because each of those computers has its own copy. The way the validation works, though, it's kind of unique. It's only a majority of the computers in the network that have to verify a transaction, and that was done more as a safeguard against individual corruption. Hard drive data fails all the time. It's a matter of when, not if. And so if you have a bad node within the blockchain system, you don't want that one bad node to deny every valid transaction that comes through. So it's based on a majority. So as long as a majority of the network agrees that it's valid, then the transaction is approved, it's validated, and added to the ledger. So at its core, blockchain technology is a network of computers that communicate through a secure protocol, and they have the same consensus mechanism across the entire network, which basically means they have the same defined rules that they use to validate or deny a transaction or a comparison. So you can imagine that this can be used beyond just currency exchange verification or verifying goods and service purchase transactions. And so what we've seen is other applications of blockchain technology. So IBM is attempting to adopt blockchain technology for supply chain validation. And then we've also seen the rise of smart contracts, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And here I've listed some other applications of blockchain technology. You can see it's kind of wide-ranging. And like I mentioned before, the real estate records in Chicago is particularly interesting because it has the potential to replace the old paper title systems that we use with land ownership going all the way back to 18 whenever. And so it would all become digital. It would all be digitized, and it would all be verifiable with very little human interaction or intervention. But let's look at smart contracts briefly. Smart contracts can be either public or private implementations of blockchains. So you could have a company like Wells Fargo or Principal that they don't want necessarily to publicly make their blockchain available, so they make it a private implementation. Principal and Wells Fargo, they both have offices around the world, so it'd be very easy for them to set up a distributed network that was controlled solely by them, and then they could keep that blockchain ledger completely in-house, or maybe they just share a portion of that information with customers. The smart contract name in and of itself is a bit of a misnomer because it's more akin to software, and so it's more accurate to call it a self-executing digital contract, but that just doesn't sound as good, so everybody goes with smart contracts. The validity of smart contracts have already been recognized in Arizona, and more than likely we'll see more states do the same. And so how these smart contracts operate is they verify the execution of obligations of both parties before they execute the end result. So whatever the contracted for good or service was, they wait until both parties have reached their obligation before releasing that good or service. It's very similar to what an escrow agent does, which is sometimes attorneys. So it has the potential to affect us. And it can also, another way that smart contracts are used is they're used to verify identity prior to execution. So the execution only becomes valid of a contract once you've submitted documentation to verify your identity that's validated on a blockchain network. And that's similar to what a notary does. So I'm gonna end with an example of a smart contract, and that's the example is if you want to rent a house or an apartment. So typically, if you want to rent a house, you have to make an application, you give a deposit, and you sign a contract. The landlord holds the deposit in escrow, maybe with his attorney, and then they provide you with the access key to the property on whatever agreed upon date the contract states. With a self-executing contract, everything would happen digitally. So you'd provide your payment via blockchain, or you pay via Bitcoin. You sign the contract digitally, and then the landlord would receive notification that you've paid the Bitcoin. Those are verified funds once they're validated on the blockchain. Then he or she would provide the digital access key on whatever the start date that contract provides. Or if they didn't provide the digital access key, and let's say they let that time period lapse, your verified funds would be returned to you. So they would no longer have access. The landlord would no longer have access to those funds. Alternatively, if the landlord provides the system with the digital access key early, then both of the assets are held, both your funds and the digital access key. They're held within the software system of the blockchain until the agreed upon date, at which point they're both released to the corresponding party. So that's the simplest form of a smart contract, but there are much more complex implementations that are occurring. So with that, I don't know if we have any time for questions, but feel free to email me later, or if you have a quick question, I can take it now.
I know we did have a couple questions come in online a bit earlier, so I might just raise those now so that the online participants can step off if they want. We're all here in the room can talk. One was, how does a government seize Bitcoin? I think referring to that bill with Grassley, and it says, how mechanically does the government become the owner of record of the Bitcoin?
Well, so the thing that's unique about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is they really are more akin to cash systems. So if somebody steals my credit card, I can turn it off. I can call the issuing bank and say, hey, my wallet was stolen, turn off my credit card. If somebody steals my wallet with $100 in cash in it, I can make a police report and hope that I get it back, but more than likely I'm not seeing that $100 again. It's the same thing with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is more similar to that cash example. So if somebody walks away with that encryption string that represents your wallet, you're no longer the owner of that Bitcoin. So whether that's the government or somebody that picks your pocket, or if you simply have it, that's why they tell you when you open a Bitcoin account to keep that hash string in multiple locations and to even print it out as an offline copy. Because if your computer crashes and that's the only place that you have that hash code, you've lost that Bitcoin.
One other question online that we had was, what information does a virtual currency administrator maintain about the identity of Bitcoin owners? Must an owner/recipient provide name, address, social security, etc. to the administrator? So
Bitcoin exchanges, they typically have quite a bit of personal information, and Coinbase in particular, they now require a social security number before they allow you to make larger transactions in Bitcoin, and that's partially in response to this IRS complaint that they got to make sure that that you are paying the taxes to the IRS as required. But as far as the actual administrators of the cryptocurrency, they don't have very much information at all. They might have your IP address associated with the transaction, but that's about it. That's why originally when Bitcoin came out, everybody thought it was a completely anonymous way to send money, which is why people like on the Silk Road were using it to buy these illegal goods and hack phone numbers or credit cards or whatever. It still takes quite a bit of effort, but that's really not the case. You can still track down the originator of the transaction. It's just, it takes quite a bit of effort to do so.
Other than the fact that this is not regulated, why does anybody even want to buy Bitcoins and work through those?
I'm not 100% sure if there's just one answer to that question, I guess, but I do know that we've seen a lot more traditional investors take interest in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies based on the just exponential growth in value that it's had. So, you know, back in 2014, Bitcoin was hovering right around $500 to $1,000. It was kind of swinging back and forth. And it is a very volatile asset. But, you know, 3 years later now, it peaked as high as $11,000 last week. It dropped down to $9,400 at the very beginning of this week, and now it's back up to about $10,500 last time I checked today. So it's a very volatile asset, and the potential for returns is much higher, but it's also a larger risk.
Any other questions?
Do you own any Bitcoin?
So I do, not very much. I used to mine. So a miner is somebody that participates in the blockchain network that I was just describing. And they're called miners because when they give up the resources of their computer to provide these services for the blockchain network, they're rewarded with either a small amount of Satoshi, or if you were an early miner, you got full Bitcoins. And so that was to kind of offset your cost of the electrical energy that you have to spend to keep your computer running all the time, and the processing power that you're losing. So I used to do that as kind of a hobby, but yeah, I don't do that anymore.
All right, well, thank you very much, Shrikant. We appreciate your presentation. Thank you, everybody, for attending.